Howdy, folks. As I'm recording this, it is January 5th. I have had the last 9 days off from work that I took to spend some time after the holidays with my son for the last few days. Had a lot of fun. Not really looking forward to going back into the office tomorrow. But during this time, I was able to get through the latest computer game, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. It is a new canon story that takes place between Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I did greatly enjoy it. However, without getting into spoilers, it actually does retcon some previous Indiana Jones material, which I have some kind of mixed feelings about. I'm going to have to mull that over a little bit over the next few days to see how that sits with me. But I will say that I thoroughly enjoyed the game. I do hold it up there, I think, with the movie continuity. I think this is a legitimate Indiana Jones entry, and I've been very much in an Indiana Jones mood. And because of that, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different this time. I hope you guys will be okay with that. I'm going to read one of the Indiana Jones novels. This is Indiana Jones and the Peril at Delphi. It's written by Rob McGregor. It was published in 1991. There were a series of novels that were written that were taking place sort of after the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. I think there may be some slight overlap, if I remember right. I don't believe these are considered canon. There's a number of reasons for that. I was not a huge fan of these novels. There were different authors throughout the series. Some of them I feel were better than others, but I thought this might be a nice palate cleanser and a change of pace. And as I said, I'm in an Indiana Jones mood. So I hope you'll be okay to come along with me for at least this one novel, and then you can let me know what you think. So, without any further babble here, this is Indiana Jones and the Peril at Delphi. It does have a dedication at the beginning that says, "For Trish, special thanks to Lucy Autry Wilson of Lucasfilm, who refused to let go when Indy's lifeline started to unravel." It opens with a quote: "The bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding go out to meet it." Thucydides. Prologue, Delphi, Greece, 1922. Indy hung in the darkness like a quarter moon, suspended by a rope that burned into his chest and armpits. He heard shouts above him, but couldn't make out the words. When he dropped his head back, the aperture high above him offered no more light than a twinkling star. "Dorian!" he yelled. "Send down another torch!" His voice bounced back and forth against the walls of the crevice. He didn't know if she had heard him or not. He rubbed his cheek against his shoulder and peered down. Blackness was everywhere, an inky veil that disoriented him, dizzied him. Nausea rolled through him. He squeezed his eyes shut and moved his hands a fraction of an inch upward on the rope, fearing that in the next second it was going to snap, and he'd follow his first torch into the fathomless darkness below him. There was no space, no time, only the pull of gravity, the suction of the void. He couldn't have dangled more than a few minutes, but it seemed he'd been hanging here for hours, waiting for light to redeem him. "Jones!" Dorian shouted. His name reverberated in the pit. He glanced up and saw a flickering light dancing towards him. The rope that held it coiled and uncoiled, serpentine, its tongue hissing fire. Indy ducked as the torch darted past his head, then grabbed the rope and snared the end of the torch. He gripped it, his breath erupting from his chest like hiccups. He peered at the wall in front of him, no longer certain if it was the right wall. Maybe he was too far down. He tugged on his rope twice, and Dumas, Dorian's assistant, lowered him another 2 feet. Then he was directly opposite the tablet. It jutted out from the stone wall like a tombstone in a graveyard and was tilted slightly downward. He pulled a four-pronged clamp from his knapsack and pounded it into the wall with a mallet. He was about to place the torch into it when something caught his eye. He held the torch in front of the tablet and leaned forward for a closer look. He'd been told the inscriptions would be caked with dirt, and that it would have to be cleaned once the tablet was taken to the surface. but he was staring at parallel rows of glyphs that were not only clearly recognizable, but were written in ancient Greek, a language he could read. His eyes skipped over the words, devouring them. Excitement knotted in his gut. He put the torch back into the holder on the wall and pulled a notepad from a side pocket of his knapsack. Quickly, he scrawled the translation. He couldn't believe it. They were right. The crazy bastards knew what they were talking about. He wanted to yell up to the top, but decided to conserve his energy. He stuffed the notebook back into the pack, pulled out the net, and carefully covered the tablet before fastening the drawstrings to a hook at the end of the rope. He was about to start chiseling at the wall to loosen the tablet when the rope suddenly jerked against his chest. He dropped several inches. The rope tightened under his arms. "Hey! What the hell is going on?" His voice ricocheted about the crevice. He was directly below the tablet now and saw pick marks under it. Someone had not only cleaned the inscription, but had tried to remove the tablet. But who? The rope jerked again. A weird creaking filled the crevice, and he knew what it was. His rope was fraying. He pulled the torch from the wall and held it up. Ah, Christ. Easy does it, he thought. He placed the torch in his mouth and reached for the rope above the spot where it was unraveling. He heard a resounding snap, a sharp, terrible sound that echoed in the crevice. His fingers snagged the rope. He dangled by one hand, the frayed end rubbing against his wrist. The torch burned the hair on his arm. His face was contorted in a grimace as he stretched his other hand over his head. Sweat beaded on his brow, trickled into his eyes. He felt a hard yank from above, and the rope slipped through his fingers. He reached desperately with his other hand, but his fist closed on black air. He fell. Chapter 1. College Capers. Chicago, 2 years earlier. The night was still and tight as the two men lumbered down a narrow lane, limp bodies draped over their shoulders. Rain from a spring shower puddled in hidden depressions, shadowed by the tall buildings on either side. They were nearing a corner, and beyond it was the grassy mall, their destination. One of the men was tall and rangy and bobbed as he walked, as if constantly readjusting the weight of the body he carted. The other was sturdy and muscular. Coils of rope hung from both sides of his belt, and he moved with the nimbleness of a mountain climber. Suddenly he stumbled in one of the ruts and lurched to the side, almost losing his balance. Nimble, yes, but also afflicted by occasional spasms of clumsiness. "Damn it!" he sputtered as he recovered his footing. It was almost over, and he was edgy. "You okay?" the tall one asked. "Fine. Let's stop a minute. I've got a bad feeling about this." The tall one unceremoniously let the body slip from his shoulder, then pulled out a flask from inside his coat. He held it out, but his partner shook his head. "No?" The tall man shrugged, and then took a long swallow. "Take it easy on that stuff," the rope man hissed. "It takes the edge off." 15 more minutes and it'll all be over," the rope man said. He hugged the shadows of the building as he moved ahead, the body still draped over his husky shoulder. When he reached the corner, he looked both ways. In spite of his concerns, he was determined to complete his mission, and he wanted every detail perfect. He turned to signal his partner, but the man was already standing behind him, the other body slung over his shoulder. They headed down a rain-slicked sidewalk, the glow of street lamps reflecting off its surface. They stopped when they reached the first light, and slid the bodies onto the grass. Barely visible under a nearby hedge were two other bodies they'd left there half an hour earlier. "Call your tune," the tall man said. "Get Payne ready. I want him first. And make sure his hat is on straight." He loosened one of the ropes coiled on his belt. A hangman's noose was knotted at the end of the rope, and with a graceful swing of his arm, he tossed it over the arc of the lamp. The noose danced in the pale light. "Okay, Slide it over his neck and make sure his name tag doesn't come off." The tall man lifted the body and worked the noose over the head. When it was tight, he reached into Payne's vest, pulled out a three-cornered hat, and fit it firmly over his head. The other man, meanwhile, had scaled the lamp post and now raised the body into place. He deftly tied the rope, then dropped to the ground. "Hey, he looks great. Now, just three more to go." The tall man tipped the flask to his mouth once more, and again he gestured with it to his partner. "We'll do George next," the rope man said in response. "God, I can't wait to see the reactions tomorrow morning." A headless figure wriggled beneath a dark gown like a magician struggling to free himself from chains and locks. Then the top of a head, a brow, and a face emerged from the dark cocoon. He straightened the gown over his bare legs and gazed at himself in a full-length mirror. He ran a hand through his thick hair, which was parted in the center, then placed his mortarboard and tassel on top of his head. The intricate lithographic lettering on his diploma would say he was Henry Jones, Jr., but those who knew him called him Indy, short for Indiana, a name he'd used since his early teens. Henry, Jr. was consigned to use on official documents, and by his father, who still called him Junior. In fact, the only visible reminder of his childhood was a scar on his jaw, which he'd gotten in a scrap with thieves he'd stumbled on in a desert cavern as they uncovered a relic of the Spanish conquest. But even his father, if he were here, would see that he was no longer a kid. He was handsome in a rugged sort of way, with clear, determined hazel eyes and the broad shoulders and musculature of a halfback. But he wasn't a football player. Although he was well coordinated, he preferred horseback riding and skiing to sports like football or baseball. He was also proficient at the use of a whip, an odd skill he rarely talked much about. Not that any of that mattered today. "I'm a college graduate," he said to himself, and smiled at the image those words conjured, but his smile revealed more than a hint of irony. He was graduating in spite of everything. He'd missed so many classes last fall, his grades had nosedived, and he'd nearly been expelled. For several weeks, he'd simply lost interest in his formal education while he was attaining another sort on the street. He and Jack Shannon, his wily roommate, had spent their nights at barrel house piano saloons on the South Side, listening to musicians with names like Pinetop Smith, Crippled Clarence Lofton, Speckled Red, and Cow Cow Davenport pound the keys on their uprights. The music was called barrel house piano because the small bars where it was played served liquor directly out of kegs. At least they had until Prohibition started a few months back. Most of the jazzmen had come up from New Orleans, the hometown of jazz, in the last 5 years, and more were arriving every week. Living conditions for Negroes were better in Chicago. There were jobs in clubs where they could make $50 a week compared to $1 a night in New Orleans. And Chicago was where the recording studios were making jazz records. When the bars closed, Indy and Shannon often headed to freewheeling rent parties where the music continued until dawn. Shannon would bring his cornet and play along with the likes of Johnny Dunn and Jabbo Smith. Not only was Shannon one of the few whites Indy had seen play jazz, but he was undoubtedly the only economics student playing the music. Most of the jazzmen in the barrel house saloons were uneducated. They didn't read music, didn't follow the rules, didn't know the rules, and didn't care. They didn't even know their music was unusual, and all of that contributed to its power and integrity. "Hey, you ready? You said you wanted to get there early, right?" He looked up, snapping out of his reverie. Shannon's red hair looked as wild as ever. His gown was draped over his arm, and he wore a coat and tie. The coat was too short in the sleeves, but he knew Shannon didn't give a damn about it. He had a habit of nodding his head when he was excited or nervous, and he was doing it now. But Shannon always seemed a bit edgy, as though he weren't really made for this world. The only time he ever seemed perfectly at ease was when he was playing his cornet. Then his lanky body seemed to flow with the music, and you no longer noticed his size 12 feet, or his long neck with its bulging Adam's apple. Indy glanced once more at himself, then removed the mortarboard. They were only a couple of blocks from the grassy mall where the ceremony was being held. They'd be there in a few minutes. "Okay, let me get dressed." I don't have my pants on yet. Dare you to go just like that. Graduate without your pants, kiddo. No thanks. Don't see any reason to do it. He watched Shannon through the mirror, knowing that he would make an offer. Tell you what, I'll buy you a bottle of hooch. We'll get plastered. Indy shrugged. Hell, with the gown on, no one would know the difference. All right. He wasn't exactly looking forward to the ceremony. He just wanted to be done with it. Not wearing any pants would at least make it somewhat interesting. I can just hear old Mulhouse now, he said as they left the house. You're a new generation, a generation of hope. His voice was deep, authoritative, mimicking the university president. The war is over. Go out into the world and show others who are less fortunate that America's young people are hard-working, productive individuals who get the job done, whatever that job may be. Something like that, he thought. No, the ceremony wasn't the reason Indy wanted to arrive early. How is it with no pants? Shannon asked as they headed down an oak-shrouded street. Cool and breezy. You should try it. Indy expected him to laugh and make a joke, but Shannon wore a pensive expression. Is your father going to be here? Indy shook his head. He's busy. Hell, he didn't even bother to apologize. Really? Yeah, that's how he is. My father, the esteemed expert on Grail lore, is a man with little time for anything or anyone outside of his scholarly pursuits. He always been like that. Only after my mother died when I was young. Ever since then, he's become somewhat distant from me, no matter what I do. I guess I majored in linguistics just to get his attention. Shannon glanced at him. How would linguistics get his attention? For as long as I can remember, he said that language is the key to understanding mankind. But so what? How can he expect me to understand mankind when I can't even understand him? I wish my family were staying home. Hell, I wish I weren't even graduating. What are you talking about, Jack? You got a job and you'll be making good money. Shannon had been hired as an accountant with a Chicago trucking company for the salary of $250 a month, a sum that seemed astonishingly high. When Indy asked how he'd gotten it, Shannon's only response was, family connections. And you'll still have time to play in the clubs, Indy continued. Hey, remember that night we went down to the Royal Gardens and saw King Oliver? Authentic New Orleans Creole jazz. It's all moving right up here into your own backyard. What more could you ask for? Shannon didn't say anything as they crossed the street. You are going to play, aren't you? Indy asked as he watched a shiny new Tin Lizzie motor past. I made a deal. Indy noted the dour expression on his face. What kind of deal? I have to stop playing jazz. That's the price of the job. Well, that's crazy. Why? It's not respectable music, Indy. Indy knew that jazz was slow to catch on, and many whites thought the syncopated beat, accenting notes when it wasn't expected, an improvisational style were jungle music. It causes the listener to move in strange, suggestive ways, he'd heard one radio commentator say. That's bullshit, Jack, because I think you could be as good as Earl Hines or Johnny Dodds. You watch. Things will change as the music catches on. I don't know if that'll ever happen. Shannon swayed from side to side, his gangly arms moving to their own beat. You know, they're even blaming jazz for those riots on the South Side. Can you believe that? The rioting had nothing to do with jazz, but the city's race riots were a sour note in a nation that was feeling good about the Allies' victory. They created a sad contrast to the big parades that marched along New York's Fifth Avenue, celebrating America's role in the triumph. It's not marching music, Indy. You know what I mean. Nobody feels like a goddamn hero when they listen to it. That's the problem. It's coming from a different place, and so am I. Indy chuckled. You could always go to Europe with me and start a new life. Don't think I haven't thought about it. I'm jealous as hell. You're going to love it. Paris, Indy was sure, would be fascinating, but he wasn't so certain about becoming an expert in ancient languages. I guess. But studying old manuscripts in libraries isn't my idea of an exciting time. You keep saying that. Why are you doing it? The opportunity was there, and I wasn't going to pass it up. Simple as that. Shannon abruptly turned down an alley and motioned for Indy to follow. Where are you going? Come on, he said in a hushed voice. I said I'd buy you a bottle. Let's get a pint and take it with us. There's a guy close by who's got it. I don't know, Jack. Prohibition was a bad joke, but Indy was anxious to get to the campus. It'll only take a minute. Come on. He shrugged and followed him. Although the two men got along well, they differed considerably in their consumption of and attitude towards alcohol. Shannon had been a heavy drinker since he was 17, and prohibition hadn't slowed his habit. Indy, on the other hand, had a low tolerance for alcohol and could take it or leave it. Halfway down the block, Shannon opened a gate and strolled along the walk to a back door. He rapped out the universal code for "It's me." Bop, 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 bop. A dog answered, yelping from inside the house. Shannon glanced back at Indy as if to make sure he was still there. A moment later, a short, frumpy man with a cross look on his face opened the door. A 2-day stubble shadowed his jaw, and his white hair was mussed, as though he'd been sleeping. He shouted at the dog, then asked what they wanted. A bottle of juice, Elmo. What else? Shannon said, with a smirk. The man motioned for them to enter. Indy smelled whiskey on his breath as soon as he stepped into the cramped kitchen. A wiry, mixed-breed dog growled from behind his master. Indy kept his distance and looked around the kitchen. Green paint was peeling from the walls, revealing patterned wallpaper. One of the cupboard doors lay on the floor where it had apparently fallen some time ago, and the room stank of urine-soaked newspapers stacked in one corner. Just a quick pint, Elmo. We're in a hurry. Good for you. He looked past Shannon and frowned at Indy's black gown. Who's this guy? A judge? Don't you know a college graduate when you see one? We're on our way to the big time. Is that right? This professor who visits me says I deserve an honorary degree. How do you like that? Elmo grinned, his teeth lining up in his mouth like a picket fence that had yellowed in the sun. A degree in what? Moonshining? Shannon asked. No, chemistry. Indy laughed, but he felt uneasy and wished they hadn't stopped. You got it or not, Elmo? We don't have all day. 50 cents. 50? Shannon threw up his hands, enraged by the price. How about a break for the new graduates? Come on, Elmo. 50 cents, Elmo retorted and crossed his arms over his chest. All right, all right. Shannon turned to Indy. You got a quarter? What about our deal? I'll pay you back. Don't worry. Indy dug into his pocket. He earned expense money by tutoring high school students in Latin and French, but never had much extra. He grudgingly handed Shannon a quarter. Elmo dropped the coins in his pocket, ambled across the kitchen, and descended into a cellar. Indy glanced at his watch. I hope he doesn't get lost down there. Shannon waved a hand impatiently, dismissing Indy's concern. Relax. We'll be there in no time. Indy saw that the dog had bared its teeth and was growling again. What's his problem? Indy grumbled. Shannon pointed at the mongrel. Shut up, Pooch. But the dog charged past them as someone banged on the door. Shannon looked towards the cellar, shrugged, then opened the door a couple of inches. Who is it? You mudda. Open up. I'm here to see Elmo. Who's there? The old moonshiner called out as he emerged from the basement. He slipped Indy the pint, and the graduate-to-be stuffed it inside his mortar-board. The door swung open, and a man in a dark coat, tie, and hat filled the doorway. He had a grim, menacing look on his face and a gun in his hand. Ah, hell. A damp chill raced up Indy's spine. Elmo took one look at the new visitor and bolted towards the front door. The man yelled for him to stop, but Elmo kept moving. The man charged through the house, the dog yelping at his heels. Indy and Shannon exchanged a glance and rushed for the kitchen door. At the bottom of the steps, Indy tripped on his gown and fell to his knees. He scrambled up and raced after Shannon, who was sprinting across the yard. Indy couldn't help laughing. They were getting away, escaping the danger, and he even had the whiskey. But then Shannon stopped abruptly and Indy crashed into him. At the gate were two cops just waiting to nab them. "Hey, you two!" "Shit!" Shannon spun, dashed across the yard, and ran between two houses. Indy didn't wait around for directions. He darted after him, hiking up his gown as he ran. He passed Shannon as they crossed the street. They fled across a succession of yards and in between houses. He was almost sure they had gotten away when he realized he'd run into a yard enclosed by an 8-foot wood fence. "Damn!" he hissed. "Watch out!" Shannon shouted behind him. Indy's head jerked around. He expected to see the cops. Instead, a pair of Doberman pinschers were dashing towards him. "Christ!" he breathed. He dropped the pint, pulled on his mortarboard, and scrambled up the fence. Just as he was about to lift a leg over the top, he was yanked back. One of the Dobermans had snared his gown. The dog snarled and shook its head from side to side as Indy struggled to get away. He reached back and jerked hard, ripping the gown from the dog's mouth. He leapt over the fence and dropped to the ground where Shannon was already waiting. They crossed another yard, ducked around a garage, then pulled up short. The two cops were standing in the alley with their revolvers drawn. "Nice going, boys." "Hold it right there," said the shorter cop. Indy froze. Now they were in trouble, and it wasn't even his trouble. "Billy?" Shannon said, rocking forward onto the balls of his feet. "That you?" "Jesus," murmured the cop. "Jack Shannon, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing. We were getting a pint. We're on our way to graduation." "Christ, Shannon." He glanced at his partner. "It's Harry's brother." He jerked his head towards the alley. "Get out of here and watch who the hell you do business with from now on." "Thanks, Billy." "Don't thank me, Jack. Harry's going to hear about this. You can count on it." Indy had no idea what Shannon's brother had to do with the cop. As they hurried towards the campus, Indy's torn gown flapped like a flag behind him. "Your brother's not a cop, is he, Jack?" An angry scowl tightened Shannon's face. "No, but he's got friends. Billy Flannery is from the neighborhood." But what were they doing? Putting a small-time competitor out of business. Harry's got territory to maintain. "The cops work for your brother?" "Wake up, Indy. They all work for the organization, and Harry's a charter member. It runs in the family." And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you all soon.